The lesson is called Little Big Man, but it's not meant to be sexist. It's about a little big man or a little big woman. It's taken from the Old Testament book of 1 Chronicles, chapter 4, verse 10. And in it, 1 Chronicles chapter 4, verse 10 says the following. Jabez cried out to the God of Israel, "Oh, that you would bless me and enlarge my territory. Let your hand be with me and keep me from harm so that I will be free from pain." And God granted his request. I'm just going to tell you, church, that buried in probably the least read section of one of the least read books in the Bible is the story about a guy named Jabez. And to get to this particular story, you have to read through almost all of 4 chapters of a book that sounds a little like a disease, the Chronicles, trying to pronounce ridiculously hard names of a nation's family tree that extends for a span of well over 1,000 years. However, 44 names into the chapter, a story just suddenly breaks through, and then the roll call resumes as if nothing happened at all. It's kind of as if the writer was saying, hey, you've just got to know a little something about this guy named Jabez. I mean, he just seems to stand head and shoulders above all the other names I've been writing about. It's the story of how things started out very badly for a person that no one has heard of, who prays a one-sentence prayer that's answered in an extraordinary way. It's a story about God's little big man. When is the last time that God has worked through each of you in such a way that you knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that God was in it? When's the last time that's occurred? Better yet, when's the last time you witnessed maybe a miracle? Even if it wasn't maybe a miracle that directly blessed you, but maybe blessed someone else. The truth is, I think, that most of us don't know how to ask for that kind of experience, much less even think that we should, because it just sounds impossible. Even embarrassingly suspicious in our very now self-serving culture in which we all belong. But here's this guy, Jabez, crying out to the God of Israel and asking for a blessing. But doesn't that sound, at least on its face, just a little demanding? I mean, shouldn't we revere God, honor God, worship God, be fearful of God, instead of treating him like a genie in a bottle, asking for maybe 3 wishes? That didn't seem to bother Jabez. Apparently, he hadn't heard that it's politically incorrect to ask God for too many blessings. Now, Jabez lived in the south of Israel after the conquest of Canaan during the time of the Judges. He was born into the tribe of Judah and eventually rose to be the head of his particular clan. In Hebrew, the word Jabez means pain, P-A-I-N. A literal reading of that word in the Hebrew means that he causes or will cause pain. Exactly. Not the sort of name that gives a whole lot of promise to a new life, right? And while all newborns give their mothers some degree of pain during childbirth, apparently there was something about Jabez's birth that went beyond the norm So much so that his mother chose to memorialize the occasion by naming her son Pain. It's like the boy named Sue if you follow Johnny Cash, right? Why would a mother call her child Pain? Hey, you're the pain. It's a good question. And maybe, I don't know, maybe the pregnancy or the delivery was traumatic. Maybe the baby was breech. Maybe the father had abandoned her during her pregnancy. Maybe the family was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, and the prospect of having another mouth to feed was just too overwhelming. Regardless, Jabez grew up with a name that every boy would love to hate. But people's names mean something, don't they? I mean, look at Kim Kardashian. Remember their first child, North? So it's Northwest. I guess for them, maybe it was a directional thing. They were hoping their child wouldn't get lost. And in the Bible, names have always had meaning. Jacob, for instance, met heel catcher or grabber. And it was a really good one-word biography of a con man for a patriarch. And in the book of Ruth, Naomi and her husband, they named their two children Mahlon and Chilion. The translation, Mahlon means sickly, and Chilion means sulking, like, feeling sorry for himself. And that's exactly how they behaved until they died in early adulthood. They were sickly and they were sulking. So maybe being called a pain, like Jabez, wasn't that bad after all. Note that Jabez asks for God's blessing, but he doesn't ask for it in such a way like sometimes we do, which I just said is like sneezing prayers. It's just like, God bless the missionaries, or God bless the food that we're about to eat, or God bless you because you just sneezed. Jabez was asking for God to impart some supernatural favor on him and his family. He wasn't asking for more of what he could get for himself. He was crying out for the wonderful, unlimited goodness that only God had the power to give. And notice too the rather radical aspect of Jabez's request. He left it entirely up to God to decide what that blessing would be, and where, when, and how he would receive it. He just asked to be blessed and left it up to God to fill in the details. This was a real radical trust in God's good intentions toward Jabez. It wasn't like asking for a Mercedes-Benz, because like Janis Joplin said, all of her friends drove Porsches and she had to make amends. It's not like one of those things. It wasn't like he was asking for a six-figure income or asking for some sort of material sign that he had found a way to cash in on his connection with God. Jabez wanted nothing more but nothing less than what God wanted for him. But then Jabez continues by asking God to enlarge his territory. Now, maybe that was a request for a bigger house. Maybe that was a request for a better job. Maybe that was a request for greater influence. I don't know. But talk about being bold. I mean, that takes a lot of nerve, doesn't it? God, enlarge my territory. Make me more influential. Make my house bigger. Make my reach more outstanding. But then again, maybe he was asking for God to enlarge his wisdom. Or maybe he was asking for God to enlarge his understanding or his humility. Or maybe his patience or love or even joy. Maybe even good health. We don't know exactly what Jabez meant when he said, enlarge my territory. Maybe it was to enlarge his mind. Maybe it was to enlarge his spirit. Maybe it was even to enlarge his character. Whatever it was, what would happen if you asked God to give you more influence to help others? What would happen if you asked God to make you more influential in your family, or in your church, or in your city, or in your community, or in this nation, or even in the world? What would happen if you asked God for that? Maybe Jabez's request was not just a desire for more real estate, but a desire maybe for more responsibility, for more opportunity, so that he could make his mark on Israel for the God whom he worshiped. In the original Hebrew, the word territory is translated as either coast or borders, kind of like a homestead or a frontier. And that would make a lot of sense in the context of what we've read, because prior to that time, Joshua had partitioned the promised land into chunks of real estate for each tribe. And then each tribe would allocate that large chunk of real estate into smaller chunks of real estate for each family and then each person. So it makes sense that that's what Jabez is talking about, enlarging his influence and his territory, because what had originally been assigned to him maybe was very small. So it's like, surely God, I was born for more than just this. I was born to do more than just this little thing that I have right now. Surely I was born for something greater than what I have. So enlarge my influence, enlarge my territory, enlarge my ability to influence others. Have you ever noticed that as opportunities expand, generally speaking, your resources do as well? Perhaps Jabez sensed the pleasure that God felt in the security and urgency of his request to accomplish great things on behalf of Israel. The truth is that typically, unfortunately, we look at territory like this: my ability plus my experience plus my training plus my personality plus my appearance, plus my past, plus the expectations of others equals my assigned territory. The truth is that territory is much better, I think, defined as your willingness and mine, your weaknesses and mine, plus God's will and supernatural power equals my expanding influence. And it's not like miracles have to break natural law to be supernatural. When Jesus stilled the storm, he didn't set aside universal law. The storm would have eventually subsided on its own, right? Or when Elijah prayed for the rain to stop or to prevent further drought, God directed the natural cycle of drought and rain to accomplish what Elijah had prayed for. Frankly, I think the reason that most of us don't witness God's miracles in our life is that we're either living under a rock or we're afraid to take a risk. Because let's face it, you don't need God when you're standing in one place. It's when you thrust yourself into the jet stream of God's plans for this world, which are beyond your abilities and mine to accomplish, and then plead with him to use you, that then his miraculous power seems to be released. At that moment, heaven sends angels and resources and strength and people that you may need to accomplish his purpose. So now Jabez is on a roll. Having made the really flabbergasting request that God increase his influence and his opportunities, he says, "Let your hand be on me." In other words, Jabez was asking that God's presence, God's love, God's power, everything be manifest in every minute of Jabez's life. More than 1,000 years later, similar words were written by the Apostle Paul. And he wrote it to a church that was struggling in this community called Philippi. He says in Philippians chapter 4, verse 19, "And my God shall supply all of your needs according to his riches in glory by Jesus Christ." In other words, it's as if God wants us to attempt something so big that failure is absolutely guaranteed unless God steps in. But that flies in the face of our just common sense. It contradicts our life's experiences. It disregards our feelings. It disregards our training. It disregards our need for security. It sets us up to look like the fool. It sets us up to look like the loser. Yet it's God's plan for his most honored servants. Dependence upon God makes heroes of ordinary people because it's not about a person's greatness. It's a matter of the person's surrender. You become dependent on the strong hand of God to turn your needs into his unlimited opportunities. For instance, in Matthew chapter 28, verses 19 and 20, here's what Jesus said to his disciples. "Go, therefore, and make disciples of all the nations," and then skipping forward, "and lo, I am with you always." In one single sentence, Jesus was giving the 11 disciples an impossible task coupled with an amazingly incredible opportunity. I mean, take the first part of it. Go into all the world and preach? Really? You're serious about that? That is a disaster in the making. Because after all, Jesus was commissioning unreliable cowards like Peter, who had already proven that a little girl could get him to curse Jesus Christ. And you're the one that's going to go out and preach to all the world? Seriously? But in 2 Chronicles chapter 16, verse 9, the writer says, "For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth." Why? To show himself strong on behalf of those whose heart is loyal to him. Please note that God isn't scanning the horizon for spiritual giants or for seminary standouts. That's not what God is looking for. He's seeking out hearts who are loyal to him. And so, church, you don't have to be a seminary standout. You don't have to be some spiritual giant. You just have to have a heart that's loyal to God. You're capable of doing that. He's seeking out hearts who are loyal to him. The problem is that loyalty is the only part of his expansion plan that God does not provide. That is up to you and me. Continue on. Finally, Jabez makes the incredible request for freedom from harm and the resultant pain that harm causes. And you're thinking, this is one verse. Does this guy not know when to stop? Have you not already asked for enough, Jabez? You've asked God for a lot. And now you're saying, keep me from harm and keep me from pain? Like, are you kidding me? Why don't you just stop where you left off? Territories and lots of blessings. Okay, I get that, but freedom from pain and freedom from suffering, protection? Yeah, he did. Because that's what Jesus would later say. Did you know that nearly 1/4 of the Lord's Prayer is a request for deliverance from pain? Matthew chapter 6, verse 13. And do not lead us into temptation, but deliver us from what? The evil one. There's nothing in there about spiritual insights. There's nothing in there about spiritual powers. Not a word about confrontation. But since God answers the prayers of those who are a threat to Satan's kingdom, we should be prepared to confront the spiritual attack that is bound to follow. So, when you put it in that context, you would think, well, a little protection, that would be a good thing, right? And what was God's answer? Quote, and God granted his request. No further comment apparently was necessary. I don't know what God did. It just says God answered his request. You see, when Jabez had a problem, he didn't go to school and get smarter. He didn't go to his friends and get advice. He prayed. When things didn't work out for him, he didn't complain. He didn't start a riot. He just prayed. When Jabez had a hopeless and desperate situation at hand, he prayed a God-sized prayer. Do you want a breakthrough in your own spiritual life? Do we want a breakthrough for this church family's spiritual life? I do. Well then, pray. Pray about it. Pray with faith. Pray with humility. Pray with confidence. Pray with perseverance until God blesses you. Now, I'm not suggesting, as some do, a prosperity gospel where you kind of name it and claim it, as they say. But what I am suggesting to you is that you pray continually and give God thanks in all of your circumstances, because that's God's will for you in Jesus Christ. And that's not me. That's what Paul said in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 17 and 18. And then to see Jesus in your neighbor, since whatever you do for your neighbor, you do for him. Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 through 46. Then God will work a miracle. He'll either calm the storm or he'll calm your heart. I want you, as I conclude, to look at an account of a very peculiar encounter that's recorded for us in the 23rd chapter of the book of Luke. It begins with an account of Herod, who was Pilate's jurisdictional counterpart. Do you remember that? Whom Pilate had skillfully used to toss a political hand grenade to avoid getting blown up. This is when Jesus was in his trial. Remember? Pilate said, you're out of my jurisdiction. Thank you, God. Let me send you over to Herod. Do you remember that? But Herod had heard a lot of stuff about Jesus. So much so that he wanted to see Jesus perform a miracle. He thought that Jesus was some sort of magician or miracle worker, and Herod just kind of wanted to see Jesus perform. The king asked Jesus a ton of questions, and all he got was silence. So after getting the silent treatment, maybe Herod handed Jesus a glass of water and said, well, why don't you change this to a glass of wine? Or maybe he asked him to take a piece of bread and make it into a loaf of bread. Still nothing. Nada. But in Luke chapter 23, verse 12, we have a curious sidebar written to us by the doctor himself. And I want you to find this in your Bible, either now or when you get home. Luke chapter 23, verse 12. Because I want you to know that I'm not telling this out of school. It is a parenthetical expression. In other words, Luke put the parentheses in there. And Luke says within the parentheses the following: Herod and Pilate, who had been enemies before, became friends that day. Now those parentheses are not mine. They are Luke's. It's as if Luke doesn't want us to miss the story and the irony of the miracle that had just occurred. Apparently, it was harder to see water change to wine than an enemy turned into a friend. In other words, Herod had received the miracle that he had requested. He just didn't see it. Jabez, labeled with sorrow and pain, uttered a simple prayer to nullify the label. Maybe Jabez thought his name was his destiny. So he prayed for God's protection from the pain that he anticipated he was going to receive or that he was going to give others. But you don't have to be a pain to pray like a Jabez. You don't have to pray a novel when one sentence will do. Just be God's little big man or woman. And then don't miss the miracle. So this week, church, pray. Pray like you never have before. And see if God doesn't bless you in ways you could not even begin to comprehend. One caveat: when you pray, be expecting an answer and walk through your spiritual life with your eyes wide open so that you can see it. That's why I included that passage out of Luke, because I thought it was so intriguing. Here's Herod wanting Jesus to perform tricks and all sorts of things for him when Jesus did perform a miracle. That by virtue of the fact that Jesus was now in front of Herod, somehow, some way, these two politicians who hated each other had now become friends. And Jesus didn't do a single thing except for be there. I think sometimes in our lives, we don't see what God is doing because we walk with our eyes half closed, instead of acting and looking forward with expectancy. Well, I prayed, and so now I'm going to look for God's blessing. And be persistent. Because there's no rhyme or reason to the number of times that you pray for something. There's no rhyme or reason to the words that you use. I mean, Jabez, you could say it in one breath. That was his prayer. And God's response was, and his request was answered. We have no idea what the answer was, but we do know that God heard him. And the reason why I bring up 1 Chronicles is if you've ever read 1 Chronicles, it is a snooze fest. These Hebrew names that you want to try and pronounce as best you can to give honor to God and reading his word is hard work. and 44 names into this book that sounds like a disease, you come across a little big man like Jabez, who had the courage and the temerity to pray a big prayer. And it was granted. And then the chronicle writer moves on with the rest of the genealogy. It's as if, don't lose sight of the fact that a person from no particular status in life can pray a big prayer and have that prayer answered. And then life goes on. And you can do the same.